The traditional theories of comparative advantage are based on constant returns to scale and perfect competition predicted that the more the countries are different, the more they should trade. The international variations in production function, factor endowments and consumer preferences determine in which goods the country has a comparative advantage and comparative disadvantage. For example, nation 1 has a comparative advantage in commodity X and nation 2 has in commodity Y, because the two countries are endowed with different factor proportions. This comparative advantage determines the pattern of trade known as inter-industry trade. However, trade is possible between countries with similar technologies and endowments. For example, trade between developed countries. The countries often export and import within the same sector. This type of trade is defined as intra-industry trade. So, intra-industry trade is a pervasive part of international trade for many countries. The few theories that serve to explain the intra-industry trade are economies of scale, the product life cycle and overlapping demand theory. Intra-industry trade arises if a country simultaneously imports and exports similar types of goods or services. Similarity is identified here by the goods or services being classified in the same sector. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that we focus on the sector cars. Intra-industry trade then occurs. For example, if Germany exports cars to France and simultaneously imports cars from Italy. Slide 8. The large portion of today's international trade is unexplained by the factors proportion theory. We assumed up till that international trade is inter-industry trade, which means that the countries are trading different goods with one another. For example, US imports cloth and exports machines, and India imports machines and exports cloth. As each country have different resource endowments, countries trade in different goods. But today, the output of modern economies involve the exchange of differentiated products of the same industry or broad product group, which is termed as intra-industry trade.
After studying this module, you will be able to understand the concept of intra-industry trade and how it differs from inter-industry trade, learn how to measure intra-industry trade, what are the different types of intra-industry trade, economies of scale explaining intra-industry trade, how each good moves through its product cycle with different stages, what are the welfare gains associated with the trade. The traditional theories of comparative advantage based on constant returns to scale and perfect competition predicted that the more the countries are different, the more they should trade. The international variations in production function, factor endowments, and consumer preferences determine in which goods the country has a comparative advantage and comparative disadvantage. This comparative advantage determines the pattern of trade known as inter-industry trade. However, trade is possible between countries with similar technologies and endowments, for example, trade between developed countries. The countries often export and import within the same sector. This type of trade is defined as intra-industry trade. Let us now assume that the economy is consisting of two countries, that is, Nation 1 and Nation 2. Each of these countries has two factors of production, capital and labor. Also assume Nation 1 is a capital abundant country, that is, has a higher overall capital labor ratio than Nation 2. The two industries X and Y in both nations are producing commodity X and commodity Y, where commodity X is capital intensive as compared to commodity Y. If commodity X is homogeneous product sector, then the trade pattern would look like as shown. Because nation 1 is capital abundant and commodity X is capital intensive, so nation 1 would export commodity X and import commodity Y. In the figure, the length of the arrows indicates the values of trade in each direction. The figure shows that nation 1 will export commodity. Now we assume that X is a monopolistically competitive industry in which number of firms produce differentiated products rather than a perfectly competitive industry producing homogeneous products. Due to the economies of scale or increasing returns, neither nation is able to produce full range of commodity X by itself. Nation 1 will produce different varieties of commodity X from those that nation 2 produces. The consumers in nation 1 may prefer the varieties produced in nation 2, so nation 1, even if running trade surplus in commodity X, will import as well as export within X industry. The pattern of trade will be as shown in figure. So the world trade in a monopolistic competition model consists of two parts. There will be two-way trade within commodity X. The inter-industry trade is explained by the principle of comparative advantage, whereas intra-industry trade is explained by product differentiation and economies of scale. The most often used method for determining the extent of intra-industry trade is Grubel and Lloyd index. It was introduced by Herb Grubel and Peter Lloyd in 1971. Here, X represents the value of exports and M represents the value of imports for a particular industry or product group. The vertical bars in the numerator of the index denotes the absolute value of the difference between the amount exported and the amount imported.
Intra-industry trade in homogeneous products. The goods being traded up till now were assumed to be the homogeneous good. For example, the goods produced in India are identical to goods produced in US. It is the inter-industry trade in homogeneous goods which was explained by factor proportion theory. But intra-industry trade can also occur in homogeneous goods due to the following circumstances. 1. Location. A nation may export and import the same product because of transportation cost. For example, there are several cement plants located on each side of the US and Canadian border. Cement users in both Canada and the US might find it cheaper to buy from a supplier on the other side of the border if that supplier is closer than the nearest domestic supplier. So exports and imports show up as intra-industry trade for both Canada and US. 2. Joint products. The homogeneous services can be the basis of intra-industry trade due to joint production of the services. For example, a country imports and exports the banking services, shipping services, insurance services because these services are produced jointly with another traded product. For example, export of computers from US to India must be transported, insured and financed. The export and import of these goods represent inter-industry trade, but the export and import of insurance, transportation and financing services to move the goods is intra-industry trade. 3. Anthropod trade. The trade where the goods are imported into a country and later the same goods are exported to another country. For example, Nation 1 exports goods to Nation 2 for warehouse facility and then Nation 2 exports these goods to another nations. Anthropod trade provides the country with relatively easy method of earning foreign exchange either by value addition or by re-exporting at the higher rate. 4. re-export trade. In this trade, goods are imported into a country and later on the same goods are exported to another country with small transformation. For example, Nation 1 import the goods and then repack and relabel these goods for use in the countries to which they will ultimately be shipped. So, in case of Anthropod and re-export trade, the trading country does not actually produce the goods, but transships it using its own facilities. 5. Seasonal variations. Seasonal variations impact both supply and demand, which results in intra-industry trade in homogeneous goods. For example, the international trade in fruits and vegetables, electricity and tourist services.
The major limitation of using intra-industry trade index is that we get very different values for intra-industry trade depending on how we define the industry or product group. For example, India imports laptops and exports desktops, then what will be the amount of intra-industry trade? So, if we define industry to be computer industry rather than laptop and desktop as a separate industry, the intra-industry trade index calculated will be 1 as exports and imports are equal. But if laptop and desktop are separately defined, then index calculated will be 0, indicating no intra-industry trade. So, more broadly we define an industry, the greater will be the value of index, and more narrowly the industry is defined, the lower the index will be. Let us now discuss some circumstances under which intra-industry trade occurs in homogeneous goods. These are location. A nation may export and import the same product because of transportation cost. Joint products. The homogeneous services can be the basis of intra-industry trade due to joint production of the services. For example, a country imports and exports the banking services, shipping services, and insurance services because these services are produced jointly with another traded product. Anthropod trade, the trade where the goods are imported into a country and later the same goods are exported to another country. For example, Nation 1 exports goods to Nation 2 for warehouse facility and then Nation 2 exports these goods to other nations. Re-export trade, in this trade, goods are imported into a country and later on, the same goods are exported to another country with small transformation. For example, Nation 1 imports the goods and then repack and relabel these goods for use in the countries to which they will ultimately be shipped. Seasonal variations. Seasonal variations impact both supply and demand, which results in intra-industry trade in homogeneous goods. For example, international trade in fruits and vegetables, electricity, and tourist services.
Types of intra-industry trade. It is customary to distinguish between two different types of intra-industry trade, each warranting a different type of explanation, namely horizontal intra-industry trade. This refers to the simultaneous exports and imports of goods classified in the same sector and at the same stage of processing. This is likely to be based on product differentiation. For example, South Korea's simultaneous import and export of mobile telephones in the final processing stage. As these mobile phones are produced using similar technology and provide similar functions, they are classified in the same sector. Nonetheless, the exported Samsung telephones differ in appearance and product characteristics slightly from the imported Nokia telephones, catering to the desires of different type of consumers. Vertical intra-industry trade. This refers to the simultaneous exports and imports of goods classified in the same sector, but at different stages of processing. This is likely to be based on increasing ability to organize fragmentation of the production process into different stages. each performed at different locations by taking advantage of the local conditions. China, for example, imports technology intensive computer components and uses its abundantly available labor force to assemble these components in the labor intensive final production stage before the components as part of the finished computer are exported again to Europe or the USA.
The most intra-industry trade is the trade in differentiated goods between the countries. Differentiated goods are the goods competing in the same market or industry that appear different from one another on the basis of their features. The differentiated products are of two types. One, horizontally differentiated goods. These goods are different, but at the same price the consumers will prefer to buy others depending on their preferences. For example, breakfast cereals available in different flavors. 2. Vertically differentiated goods, the goods that have very different characteristics and also different prices. For example, mobile phones and automobile sector. The international trade resulting due to differentiated products is due to economies of scale in the product's production. Economies of scale can be of two types: internal economies of scale and external economies of scale. Internal economies of scale: the scale economies are internal when the firm's increase in output causes a decline in its average cost. Most firms in the automobile industry are subject to internal economies of scale. External economies of scale: it occurs when the cost per unit of output depends on the size of the industry. In developing countries such as China, external economies are pervasive in manufacturing. As the industry expands output, several factors may influence cost for all firms. Product life cycle serves to explain the intra-industry trade. The product life cycle theory is an economic theory that was developed by Raymond Vernon in 1966. The theory of product cycle is that as each good moves through its product cycle, there will be changes in the geographical location of where and how the good is produced. So the changes in technology or a new product design can change the pattern of imports and exports. The reasons because of which high income and labor saving products are most likely to be introduced in rich nations are: the opportunities are greatest in these countries. The development of the new products requires proximity to markets so as to benefit from consumers in modifying the product. There is need to provide service which can be easily done by the advanced nations. Let us now understand this theory with the help of diagram. In figure, we have measured quantity along the y-axis and time along the x-axis. In stage 1 or new product phase, the product is produced and consumed only in the innovating country. New products are introduced to meet local needs, and new products are first exported to similar countries, that is, countries with similar needs, preferences, and incomes. Stage 2, growth. In product growth phase, production is perfected in the innovating country and increases rapidly to accommodate the rising demand at home and abroad. At this stage, there is not yet any foreign production of the product, and the innovating country still has a monopoly in both the home and exports market. Stage 3, maturity. In product maturity phase, the product becomes standardized and the innovating firm may find it profitable to license other domestic and foreign firms to manufacture the product. Thus, in this stage, the imitating country starts producing the product for domestic consumption. Stage 4, saturation. This is a period of stability, as now the product has become standardized, the imitating country facing the lower labor cost and no longer requiring development and engineering skills, the product will begin to undersell in the innovation.
The international trade resulting due to the differentiated products is due to economies of scale in the production process. Economies of scale means that as the production of goods increases, the cost per unit falls. This is known as decreasing cost or increasing returns to scale. It creates an incentive for firms to specialize in production, which stimulates intra-industry trade. Scale economies have, however, not featured prominently in international theory because of their presence makes trade pattern indeterminate. This inherent arbitrariness of trade patterns holds whether scale economies are external or internal to the firms. Internal economies of scale. The scale economies are internal when the firm's increase in output causes a decline in its average cost. Most firms in the automobile industry are subject to internal economies of scale. For example, Toyota produces a large number of automobiles at relatively lower prices. External economies of scale. It occurs when the cost per unit of output depends on the size of the industry. In developing countries such as China, external economies are pervasive in manufacturing. As the industry expands output, several factors may influence cost for all firms. 1. Labor pooling. Large industry may attract a pool of workers, reducing employee search and hiring costs of each firm. 2. Knowledge spillovers. Workers from different firms may more easily share ideas that benefit each firm when a large industry exists. 3. Specialized equipment or services may be needed for the industry, but are only supplied by other firms if the industry is large and concentrated. Slide 22. Product life cycle serves to explain the intra-industry trade. It explains why we may turn from exporting product to importing that product over time. The product life cycle theory is an economic theory that was developed by Raymond Vernon in 1966. The theory of product cycle is that as each good moves through the product cycle, there will be changes in the geographical location of where and how the good is produced. So, the changes in technology or a new product design can change the pattern of imports and exports. According to this model, when a new product is introduced, it usually requires high skilled labor to produce. As the product matures and acquires mass acceptance, it becomes standardized and then it can be produced by mass production techniques and less skilled labor. Therefore, the country that has comparative advantage in the production of product shifts from the innovating developed country that originally introduced it to the developing nations where labor is relatively cheaper. This can be accompanied by foreign direct investments from innovating nation to nations with cheap labor. The example of product life model is provided by the experience of US and Japanese radio manufacturers. Since World War II, the radio was a well-established product. US manufacturers dominated the international market for radio because the vacuum tubes were initially developed in the United States. But as the production technologies spread, Japan used cheaper labor and captured a large share of the world radio market. The transistor was then developed by US companies. For a number of years, US radio manufacturers were able to compete with the Japanese, who continued to use outdated technologies. Again, the Japanese imitated the US technologies and were able to sell radios at more competitive prices.
The welfare implications of intra-industry trade occurring in homogeneous products and in horizontally or vertically differentiated products are: consumers gain from having a greater variety of goods to choose. Intra-industry trade is effective in reducing the monopoly power of domestic firms. The increased output results in price decline not only in the export market but also in the domestic market due to economies of scale.
Let us now recapitulate what we have studied in this module. The intra-industry trade model and the complementary trade theories explained the significant portion of international trade that was unexplained by Heckscher-Ohlin model and Ricardo. Intra-industry trade is a two-way trade in similar products. The common measure of intra-industry trade is the Intra-Industry Trade Index. Intra-industry trade is a large and growing portion of international trade. It can occur in homogeneous products and differentiated products. It widens the size of market where firms take advantage of economies of scale. There are internal economies of scale and external economies of scale, which creates an incentive for firms to specialize in production, which stimulates intra-industry trade. The intra-industry trade is also explained by the product cycle model. It explains that each good moves through the product cycle and the changes in the technology or a new product design can change the pattern of imports and exports. The welfare is improved in intra-industry trade from increased choice and competition. Prices tend to be lower in trade in differentiated products. Firms can produce at higher levels, realizing economies of scale leading to lower prices. Thus, intra-industry trade is nothing more than increased division of labor, which, as Adam Smith pointed out, is dependent on the size of the market. As countries have grown economically and become more integrated into the world economy, they have faced larger market, which has permitted further division of labor. Vertical specialization, that is the location of different stages of production in different countries, underlies the growth and current preponderance of intermediate goods in international trade. The intra-industry trade literature has tended to focus more on horizontal intra-industry trade involving finished products such as automobiles. But here too, expansion of the market permits finer specialization. Explaining growing intra-industry trade in terms of increased division of labor due to expanded market size has several implications. The most developed countries will have taken the division of labor furthest, while less developed countries are likely to have simpler export mixes. With economic growth and falling transport costs, intra-industry trade will tend to increase over time. Trade liberalization plays a similar role to falling transport costs in encouraging finer specializations.